In the autumn of 1860, the most valuable export commodity in the Western world was not gold, and it was not oil. It was cotton, and almost all of it came from one place. The plantations of the American South were shipping the raw fiber to Liverpool and Manchester in such volume that entire English towns existed for no other purpose than to spin it into cloth. Textiles accounted for a staggering share of Britain's export economy, and the overwhelming majority of the raw material feeding it grew in the soil of Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. Southern planters and their political class had drawn an obvious, seductive conclusion from these numbers. Whoever controlled cotton controlled Britain's mills, and whoever controlled Britain's mills controlled Britain's foreign policy. They called it King Cotton, and they said it the way men say things they have never had to test. It sounded like leverage. It sounded like the kind of power that wins wars before they're fought. By the spring of 1863, that theory was being tested in the most literal way imaginable, and it was failing. The Union naval blockade had sealed off southern ports, cotton was rotting in warehouses it could not leave, and the Confederate government, recognized by no major power on earth, unable to tax its own citizens effectively, and printing money at a pace that would soon make that money worthless, needed hard currency to buy the rifles, the ironclads, and the gunpowder that cotton alone could no longer purchase. The empire of cotton was, in practice, an empire that could not get its own product out of the country. And into that vacuum stepped a French-based, German-born banker named Frédéric Émile d'Erlanger, offering a financial instrument so strange that nothing quite like it had existed before. A war bond sold in London denominated in pounds sterling that could be redeemed for southern cotton at a price a quarter of what cotton was selling for on the open market. On paper, it looked like the deal of the decade. Almost nobody who bought it understood what they were actually buying. There is a letter, still preserved in the official diplomatic correspondence of the Confederate government, written by Secretary of State Judah Benjamin to his commissioner in Europe, John Slidell, in the weeks after the loan's terms had been finalized. In it, Benjamin doesn't talk about interest rates. He doesn't talk about cotton deliveries or blockade running. He talks about something else entirely, a political advantage that had, in his words, carried great weight in the decision to accept terms his own negotiators privately called onerous. Read that sentence again. The Confederacy's own Secretary of State was telling his man in Paris that the money was almost beside the point. So if the money wasn't really the point of the largest financial instrument the Confederate States of America ever floated on a foreign exchange, what was? What exactly was a bankrupt, unrecognized, blockaded nation actually purchasing when it agreed to terms it knew were bad? To understand why a government at war would knowingly accept a disadvantageous loan, you have to understand how bad its options had already become. The Confederacy's fiscal position by late 1862 was not merely weak. It was structurally, almost philosophically, broken. Southern political culture had built itself on an allergy to centralized taxation, and that allergy did not disappear just because the nation was fighting for its existence. Taxes accounted for roughly 8% of Confederate government revenue during the war, a number that would have been considered reckless by the standards of any European treasury of the era. The Confederate Congress compensated the only way it knew how. It printed money, and it printed a great deal of it. Between January 1861 and February 1864, the Confederate money supply expanded by roughly 1,200%, from around $100 million in circulation to more than $3.5 billion. The predictable result followed on schedule. By the historian Eugene Lerner's price index, Confederate commodity prices rose from a baseline of 100 in early 1861 to over 5,000 by March 1865, inflation that averaged more than 10% a month for years on end. Money financing, essentially the printing press, accounted for close to 60% of Confederate war revenue. Debt issuance, mostly to its own increasingly reluctant citizens, made up another third. There's a bitter irony buried in the numbers that most audiences never hear, and it belongs in any honest account of this story. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, had spent part of his career in the United States Senate defending the state of Mississippi's decision to default outright on bonds it owed to British and European creditors in the 1840s. Davis had ridiculed the crocodile tears of ruined foreign bondholders and declared that Mississippi cared nothing for the verdict of the civilized world. Union propagandists in Europe made sure that record followed him. Pamphlets circulated through London financial circles reminding investors exactly who now sat in Richmond's presidential mansion, a man on public record defending sovereign default as a matter of principle. It is one of history's more pointed coincidences that the government, now desperate for European credit, was led by the one American politician most publicly associated with stiffing European creditors. That reputation mattered enormously because it meant the biggest houses in European finance wanted nothing to do with the Confederacy. The Rothschilds, the dominant merchant bank on the continent, declined to touch Confederate paper. So did Barings. The historian Niall Ferguson, who has written extensively on the Rothschild dynasty, notes that a pro-slavery government with a poor credit history and no formal diplomatic recognition from a single major power was, from the perspective of the era's most prestigious financiers, simply radioactive. By November 1862, the Confederacy's credit situation in Europe had degraded to something close to a full stop. A British arms supplier called Saul, Isaac, Campbell and Company, the firm responsible for a large share of the Enfield rifles that armed Confederate infantry, cut off trade credit entirely because Richmond had fallen behind on its bills. Without new financing, the flow of British-manufactured weapons into the Confederacy was about to dry up completely, at the exact moment the war was entering its most brutal phase. This was the environment, desperate, blacklisted, and running out of guns, into which Erlanger and Company made its offer. Nobody serious wanted this deal except a second-tier firm willing to gamble on a war nobody could yet be sure was lost. Frédéric Émile d'Erlanger was not, by the standards of Paris high finance in 1862, an obvious candidate to become the Confederacy's banker. He came from a Jewish banking family with roots in Frankfurt, part of that wave of 19th-century German Jewish financiers who built their careers on the margins of the continent's most established houses, precisely because the oldest and most prestigious institutions, the Rothschilds among them, were often closed to them at the highest levels. Erlanger built his own firm rather than inherit a seat at someone else's table, and by his late 20s he had developed a reputation as an ambitious operator willing to underwrite risk that older, more conservative houses would not go near. That willingness to gamble where established capital refused to tread was, in a sense, the entire business model. It is worth noting that this was not philanthropy or ideological sympathy for the Southern cause. It was arithmetic. A desperate borrower with no other options will agree to terms a healthy one never would, and terms like that are where a young, hungry banking house makes its name. Erlanger first approached Confederate representatives in October 1862 with a proposal to float a loan as large as £5 million. Confederate officials, in a rare moment of financial caution, turned that figure down, judging correctly that they had no realistic way to service a debt that size. What they settled on instead was smaller, stranger, and ultimately more consequential to Erlanger's own life than to the Confederacy's war effort, because in the process of negotiating it, Erlanger grew close to John Slidell's family in Paris, and the following year he married Slidell's daughter, Mathilda. The banker underwriting the Confederacy's most famous foreign loan became, quite literally, family to the diplomat who arranged it. The terms that emerged from months of negotiation between Slidell and Erlanger were signed in the early months of 1863 and made public in a prospectus on March 19. The Confederacy authorized a 20-year, £3 million sterling bond, paying 7% annual interest in 2 semi-annual installments, with a sinking fund that would retire a portion of the principal every 6 months by lottery. Erlanger's firm agreed to sell the bonds to the public at 90% of face value while purchasing them from the Confederacy itself at a steep discount beneath that, a spread that, once fees and commissions were included, meant the Confederacy would net only a fraction of the headline number. And there was the feature that made the whole instrument famous. Bondholders could exchange their paper for Confederate government cotton at 6 pence a pound, delivered somewhere within 10 miles of a navigable river or port inside the Confederacy, at a moment when that same grade of cotton was selling on the Liverpool Exchange for roughly 24 pence a pound. On paper, the arithmetic was almost absurd. Buy the bond, redeem it for cotton at a quarter of the market price, ship it home, and pocket the difference. The one detail that tended to get lost in the excitement was that, delivered inside the Confederacy, meant a bondholder had to physically run the Union naval blockade to collect the cotton, then run it again to get the cargo back out to a European market. It was less an investment prospectus than an invitation into the shipping insurance underworld of blockade running, dressed up in the language of a government bond. Confederate negotiators knew the deal was lopsided. James Mason, one of the Confederacy's senior diplomats in Europe, wrote afterward that the terms were vastly better than an earlier outline but still so unfavorable that his delegation would have walked away from the table entirely, if not, in his own words, for the political considerations indicated by Slidell. That phrase does a great deal of quiet work. It confirms that the men actually in the room understood, going in, that they were accepting bad economics for the sake of something else. Judah Benjamin's letter back to Slidell makes the same trade explicit from Richmond's side. The political advantages of the loan carried enough weight that the government agreed, as Benjamin put it, to make a sacrifice. Put together, these two documents amount to an admission from the men who actually negotiated the loan that they didn't fully believe in it as a financial instrument. They believed in it as leverage, a hoped-for down payment on something no cotton bond could technically buy, recognition from London and Paris as a legitimate sovereign nation. While Slidell and Erlanger were finalizing bond terms in Paris, a separate and seemingly unrelated drama was unfolding in the shipyards of Birkenhead, on the Mersey opposite Liverpool. A shipbuilder named John Laird was constructing two enormous ironclad rams for a buyer whose identity was concealed behind layers of shell companies, vessels more heavily armed and armored than anything in the entire Union Navy, capable, by most naval assessments of the time, of breaking the blockade single-handedly and potentially shelling northern coastal cities. The American minister in London, Charles Francis Adams, and his staff, including the young Henry Adams, spent months trying to prove what everyone already suspected: that the Laird rams were being built for the Confederacy in direct violation of British neutrality law. This looked, on the surface, like a pure story of espionage and diplomatic brinkmanship, entirely separate from bond markets and interest schedules. It wasn't separate at all. John Laird himself turned out to be a cotton bondholder, one of roughly 200 bonds by later newspaper accounts, and Confederate agents in Europe would go on to settle part of what they owed British suppliers, including firms tightly linked to the Laird shipbuilding network, using repurchased cotton bonds as currency. The financial instrument selling investors a piece of southern cotton and the ironclad warships threatening to draw Britain into open war with the United States were, underneath the surface, drawing from the same pool of money, the same handful of financiers, and in some cases, the same individual bank accounts. Here is where the story stops looking like a straightforward tale of wartime finance and starts looking like something closer to a conspiracy that almost documents itself. Within weeks of the bond's public offering, its price began to slide below the £90 issue level, largely on uncertain war news. That decline threatened disaster because the loan's payment schedule required subscribers to keep sending installments over the following months, 5% on application, 10% on allotment, and further payments stretching all the way to October 1. If the bond's market price kept falling, subscribers had every financial incentive to simply walk away from those future payments and eat the loss already sunk. So Erlanger and the Confederate government did something that would raise serious regulatory eyebrows in any modern securities market. They secretly used part of the loan's own proceeds to buy back nearly half of the outstanding bonds on the open market during April and May of 1863, artificially propping the price back up near its original offer level. It worked. Nervous subscribers, seeing a stable or rising price, made their remaining payments on schedule, and the Confederacy quietly resold many of the repurchased bonds later that year. The seller of the bond was secretly buying its own product to fake the very market confidence that convinced other people to keep paying for it. And Erlanger's own compensation for underwriting the loan was ultimately paid, in part not in cash but in bonds valued at roughly £390,000, meaning the banker who arranged the deal, and had just married into the family of the man who negotiated it, took a substantial share of his fee in the very paper he had helped manipulate the price of. Then there is the Parliament question, which is where the story's political and financial threads finally, uncomfortably collide. Multiple sitting members of the British Parliament held Confederate cotton bonds. William Lindsay, a shipping magnate and MP, held bonds valued at more than £15,000 at par, and it was Lindsay who rose in the House of Commons in July 1863 to argue that if England, in concert with the Emperor of France, pronounced the word recognition, it would go forth as a harbinger of peace. Lord Robert Cecil and John Roebuck, both cotton bondholders, made similar overtures. Roebuck went so far as to travel to France to sound out Napoleon III on joint Anglo-French intervention, a trip the British government itself had not authorized. There has even been a long-running historical dispute, first raised by the journalist John Bigelow and disputed by Gladstone's own biographer John Morley, over whether William Gladstone, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, later Prime Minister, held cotton bonds himself. It cannot be proven with certainty, and honest historians remain divided on it. But the pattern among the men who could be confirmed is damning enough on its own. Some of the loudest advocates in the British Parliament for recognizing Confederate independence were also financially exposed to a Confederate victory, or at minimum, to a Confederate bond that would only pay out in full if that government survived to honor it. This is precisely the political advantage Judah Benjamin's letter had been counting on all along, not persuasion through diplomacy, but influence purchased, quietly and legally, through a bond prospectus. Recognize now what actually happened here. A financing instrument that raised less than 2% of total Confederate war expenditure was never really designed to fund the war. It was designed to manufacture a domestic political constituency inside the British Parliament itself with a personal financial stake in Confederate survival. It very nearly worked, and then it didn't. In the first week of July 1863, Confederate forces were defeated at Gettysburg and, the same week, surrendered Vicksburg on the Mississippi. Hansard's parliamentary record, the official transcript of debates in the House of Commons, shows something striking. After those two defeats, there is not a single further recorded discussion of Southern recognition. Not one. The historian James McPherson later called the twin defeats the coup de grace of Confederate hopes for recognition, and the record bears him out with almost eerie precision. Even the bondholding MPs who had been agitating for intervention went quiet. The American diplomat Henry Adams, watching from London, wrote within weeks that it was now conceded that all idea of intervention is at an end. The bonds price chart from that summer tells the same story without a word of narration needed. A steady climb through the spring, a sharp break in July, and a long, grinding decline that tracked the Confederacy's battlefield fortunes almost exactly for the rest of the war. What followed was not collapse but a strange, drawn-out arrangement, in which the Confederacy kept honoring its debt to foreign bondholders long after it had effectively stopped being able to honor almost anything else. By early 1865, with Union armies closing on Richmond and monthly inflation exceeding 50%, Confederate Treasury notes traded for less than 2 cents on the gold dollar. Confederate soldiers were going without shoes, without rations, in some units without functioning weapons. And yet the government made a cotton bond interest and principal payment in September 1864, and another in March 1865, a total of roughly £234,000 sterling, funded in part through last-minute sales of ships built in Europe, just weeks before Richmond fell and Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Cotton bonds were still trading at roughly half their par value in January 1865, a staggering premium compared to worthless Confederate paper money. Why would a government on the verge of annihilation prioritize a small class of mostly wealthy foreign creditors over its own starving citizens and soldiers? The economist Mark Weidenmeyer, who has studied the episode closely, argues the answer is neither sentiment nor honor. It was leverage of a different kind. The same firms holding cotton bonds, particularly gun suppliers like Saul, Isaac, Campbell and Company, could cut off the flow of British-manufactured weapons if payments lapsed, exactly as they had in 1862. The Confederacy served its foreign creditors not out of principle, but because its own army's supply chain depended on staying current with them. It was coercion dressed as creditworthiness, right up until the surrender made the whole question moot. When the Confederacy finally collapsed in the spring of 1865, the cotton bonds collapsed with it, becoming, in the end, exactly what most sovereign war debt from a defeated nation becomes. Worthless paper repudiated by the government that no longer existed to honor it. Of the original £3 million issue, private investors were left holding close to £2 million worth of bonds with no government left to redeem them. Total net benefit the Confederacy actually extracted from the entire scheme, after buybacks, commissions, resales, and debt service payments, came to something under £1.5 million sterling. By the historian Judith Fenner Gentry's reconstruction of the surviving Confederate Treasury records, against a war whose total expenditures ran into the hundreds of millions. Less than 2% of the cost of the war, purchased at the price of years of diplomatic maneuvering, a manipulated bond market, and a compromised foreign parliament. Erlanger and Company, for its part, walked away largely unscathed. The firm pivoted in the years after the war into financing railroads across the defeated American South during Reconstruction. Through a long chain of later mergers, Erlanger Limited, then Philip Hill Higginson Erlanger, then Hill Samuel, eventually absorbed into what became Lloyd's Banking Group. The institutional lineage of the bank that once bankrolled a slaveholding rebellion survives, in diluted and unrecognizable form, inside one of Britain's largest modern financial institutions. Empires end. The banks that finance them, more often than not, simply change their letterhead. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to tell this story as a clean tale of shadowy bankers conspiring to prop up slavery for profit, and that framing, however satisfying, overstates what the historical record actually supports. Erlanger was not ideologically committed to the Confederate cause. He was a banker taking a calculated risk that more conservative houses declined, and he was hardly alone in that calculation. Ordinary British speculators bought these bonds too, plenty of them with no political motive beyond an attractive-looking arbitrage. Historians genuinely disagree about why the Confederacy kept servicing this particular debt as its economy disintegrated. Some, like Weidenmeyer, emphasize the trade sanction and gun supply pressure. Others point to reputation effects, to the political hope for recognition lingering longer than the record technically justifies, or simply to bureaucratic momentum. Richmond's communications with its European agents were disrupted by the siege, and it's entirely possible some payments continued because nobody had gotten around to stopping them. The Gladstone bondholding claim, repeated in some popular accounts as settled fact, is contested by serious historians and probably shouldn't be presented as certain. None of this erases the uncomfortable pattern of parliamentary conflicts of interest, the secret price manipulation, or Judah Benjamin's own letter admitting the deal was about politics more than money. History rarely hands you a single villain pulling a single lever. More often it hands you a dozen people, each making a locally rational decision: a desperate Treasury Secretary, an ambitious young banker, a handful of British investors chasing yield, a government that had already convinced itself its cause was inevitable, that add up collectively to something that looks, in hindsight, uncomfortably like a scheme. What the Erlanger Loan actually teaches has less to do with the Confederacy specifically and more to do with what happens whenever a government runs out of legitimate options and still needs the world's money. It reaches for financial engineering to do the work that military victory or genuine legitimacy can no longer do on their own, dressing political persuasion up as an investment product, and hoping investors won't look too closely at which one they're actually buying. It very nearly worked, not because the bond made economic sense, but because a handful of the men voting on recognition in the British Parliament had quietly become financially interested parties in the outcome. That is not a 19th century curiosity. Sovereign bonds, foreign lobbying, and legislators with undisclosed financial stakes in policy outcomes did not go extinct with the Confederacy. They just got better lawyers and better disclosure loopholes. The uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind is that money and political influence have never actually been separate categories. The ledger just gets rewritten to make them look that way. If you want to see how deep that pattern runs and where else in history a bond, a loan, or a line of credit quietly bought outcomes no army could, drop the word ledger in the comments and we'll go further down that thread in the next one. If this kind of history, the banking angle nobody puts in the textbooks, is what you came here for, the subscribe button is right where you'd expect it to be, and it costs considerably less than a Confederate cotton bond ever did.